here. As you know, my name is Paolo DiGregorio. I'm a historian and archaeologist. I spend a lot of time telling stories about the past, different aspects of history, different aspects of the culture. Today, what we're going to be doing is diving into the early history of baseball. Now, why are we talking about baseball? Well, it's June, and sometimes it's sunny out. It's baseball season. It's baseball weather, and baseball is one of those things that defines American society. Defines a lot of the aspects of our daily life. Even if baseball isn't as popular as it once was, the idea of baseball, the themes of baseball do play a role in our everyday, day-to-day interactions. For example, 3 strikes and you're what?
Out.
You're out. 3 strikes and you're out. Where does that come from? It comes from baseball. If you're out of left field, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Kind of far away from everything else. Where does that term come from? It comes from baseball. There are all sorts of common terms, common ideas that come from this sport, this so-called national pastime, that really do linger and that do permeate American society and the way that we talk to one another. So what we're going to look at is the early history of baseball. They're called the national game. We're going to look at about an 80-year period from 1840 to 1920. It's an important period in establishing baseball as we think of it today, as a professional sport with superstar athletes and that sort of stuff. All comes out of this early time period in baseball history. And that brings us to a question. Where does baseball begin? Who starts baseball? Is it invented by anybody? Is there a name that's associated with early baseball? You can think of. Does anybody know that name? Abner Doubleday. Well, Abner Doubleday is a name that is associated with early history of baseball. There have been claims that Doubleday invented baseball, that he is the father of baseball, one who came up with the rules of the game. Now, Doubleday, as you can see here, was a military officer general during the American Civil War. He was a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point in class of 42. So, 1842. So to serve in the Mexican War, he served in the Civil War. He spent a lot of time in his youth in Cooperstown, New York. And in the early 20th century, a legend springs up around Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown. The legend was that sometime in 1838, 1839, Doubleday invented baseball. He wrote out the rules, he created the game, and he was the one who created baseball itself. Now that is a nice story, but it is probably wrong. Because Doubleday was not in Cooperstown, New York in 1839. He was out at West Point. He never left West Point for the 4 years that he was a cadet at the academy. And Doubleday himself, in all of his writings, in all of his letters to his diarist, never mentioned anything about baseball. So it's very unlikely that he was the one who invented baseball. Well, where does that myth come from? Where does that story of Abner Doubleday come from? It actually emerges in the early 20th century, after Doubleday is no longer around. Around 1905, 1908, when baseball is trying to figure out its history, trying to develop a history, and a commission is put together called the Mills Commission. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. That is where we get the story of the origins of baseball and Abner Doubleday. Now, in reality, if Doubleday didn't create baseball, where does it come from? Well, it's a nice echo in here, actually. Well, baseball is probably a game that developed over many, many years from other bat and ball games. If we think about it, what is one of the simplest ways of entertaining? Taking a ball and throwing it, having a stick and hitting the ball. That has been known on for centuries. In fact, as far back as the early 16th century, during the reign of Henry VIII of England, Henry VIII famous for his many wives, there are records of games being played with the ball being thrown and struck by a stick. So there is this tradition of this type of gameplay that goes on for centuries and centuries. By the time we get to the 18th century, In England, even here in well, at that time were the British colonies, there are traditions of playing these batted ball games. Some call baseball, as two separate words, sometimes called rounders. It is believed by many baseball historians that it is rounders, and this tradition of throwing a ball and hitting with a stick and then running from base to base to base, that is the origins of baseball. This is where American baseball develops from this English game called rounders. Now, let me see a couple of depictions of rounders being played. There are some distinct differences between rounders and baseball. One is the shape of the playing field. In rounders, you had 4 bases you had to run to, but it wasn't laid out in a diamond like we think of a baseball field today. What you had was essentially an open square. So the batter or the hitter would stand in one spot, a ball would be thrown under an edge, just inflated over here. You would hold a small slab in your hand with one hand, take a whack at the ball, and then you were left on a wooden post where you were batting to a wooden post, to another wooden post, to another wooden post, to a 4th wooden post that was far away from where you started. You were basically making this circuit around these posts that were set up. Now, how did the base runner, for lack of a better term, to use a modern baseball term, get put out? You threw the ball at them. If you hit them with the ball, they were out. By necessity, the ball that was used in rounders was a little bit softer than we think of as a modern baseball. And it was, indeed, that was mainly played by children, that was played in the countryside, as you see depicted over here. They had all different genders, all different ages involved in it. It was a simpler game than baseball develops to be. So it is from this game, from rounders, and similar games like this, cricket, for example, evolves kind of around the same time, that this idea of baseball emerges and begins to develop here in the United States. So by the 1820s and 1830s, we begin to see rounders being transformed somewhat here in this country into something that looks like baseball. And by the time we get to the 1830s and 1840s, what we see are that there are 2 centers where this sport is beginning to evolve, the word is beginning to grow. One is in the vicinity of New York City. You see lots of baseball being played around New York City. The other is in the vicinity of Boston. So Boston and New York become the 2 hubs where this sport is developing, where this sport is growing. Now, how well do Boston and New York get along? Both in politics, in sports, and baseball, they are natural rivals to one another. And we see that here at the very beginning of the story of baseball. Because as the sport is evolving, as clubs are being formed in Boston and New York, there are sets of rules that are created. And we end up having 2 rule books that are created for the sport of baseball. One is called the Knickerbocker Rules. These are the ones that developed in the vicinity of New York City. The others were called the Massachusetts Rules. They are similar in the fact that you have this game of baseball that involves hitting the stroke ball and running from base to base to base. But they do differ in certain significant aspects. In the Knickerbocker Rules, the field is shaped like a diamond with 4 bases, and the hitter stands at one base, over here at the top, and a pitcher throws the ball at the hitter, and the hitter hits the ball and runs around the base mats, coming back to this home base. Now, in the New York game, rather than throwing the ball at the runner to get them out, you would tag the runner with the ball. Now, that was significant because it does lead to changes in the ball itself. Rather than make it a softer ball, it becomes a harder ball, because you're now whipping it at somebody to get them out, you're now tagging it out. So you have that important development that happens in the New York game. In the Massachusetts game, as it's called, town ball, this rule book over here, what you have is a square-shaped field. It's a diamond turned outside, basically, and a thrower in the middle of a strike over here in between 2 bases. So you're kind of standing, for lack of a better term, between home plate and first base to start off. You get the ball and you run around those 4 bases. That's how you score. So it kind of has that aspect of rounders still to it. But in the Massachusetts game, the putting out the runner by throwing the ball at them remains. So the ball in the Massachusetts game, they soften. And what we begin to see is that Boston and New York begin to cement these rules. These become the two hubs to where this game begins to grow in these urban centers. It does go to other cities. Philadelphia for a while embraces the Massachusetts rules before then turning to the New York rules, the Knickerbocker rules. It does come out to the Midwest, places like Pittsburgh and Chicago and Cleveland. They all start to embrace aspects of the game, different forms of baseball itself. So you have these two identities for baseball that will come into play in shaping the game as we know it today. The Knickerbocker rules are closer to the modern game. The Massachusetts or town ball rules are closer to grounders, but they do both contribute to the growth of the game itself. Now, New York, of course, at this time is the largest city in the United States, the most populous city in the United States, has a lot of people milling about, has a lot of people coming into the city. And what we see in New York is that it is there that baseball really begins to flourish. And you have a proliferation of baseball clubs. Lots of different organizations forming together to play this game. They start playing at any open patch they can find in the city. Some baseball fields end up in what is today Midtown Manhattan. At that time, it was all countryside. So you have a lot of baseball fields being developed there, a lot of baseball diamonds being laid out, and the organization of baseball clubs. What are the earliest of those clubs? Oh, it's the New York Knickerbockers. You see over here, actually, there's two New York clubs that Knickerbocker League Excelsior. That's a photograph from about 1858. And they essentially become kind of the model of what a baseball club would be. Now, this time, baseball was entirely amateur. It was men getting together on a Saturday afternoon to play a game in the park. The clubs were like any modern club. People paid their club dues, and they would be provided with uniforms, the equipment as they go out and play the game as they saw fit. Now, one of the important things to merge out of the Knickerbockers is this man here. In the center, his name is Alexander Cartwright. Alexander Cartwright is given credit for formalizing the rules of baseball. He is the one who supposedly wrote down the modern rules of the game, describing the size of the field, the makeup of the ball, how the 3 strikes and you're out, and all of that sort of stuff. That is probably, again, a legendary attribution. It's very unlikely that Cartwright sat down one day and wrote the rules of the game. We know that he was involved in the Knickerbocker Club. We know that he was there for a few years, involved in kind of organizing and maintaining, but he probably was not the guy who wrote the rule book. Yet that has an active region index, and he does emerge as kind of an important player, an important figure in the early history of baseball with these ideas, these legends that coalesce around him. Regardless of that, what we do see is that in the 1840s, 1850s, baseball begins to grow, begins to spread in popularity as the American population spreads westward across the continent. As you make our way out in California by the 1850s, you see that people from the eastern cities moving out into the new parts of the country and bringing baseball with it, whether it be New York baseball or Boston baseball. The game itself was expanded, and what that leads to in the pre-Civil War era is really a tremendous growth of the game. The game is played in lots of different places across the United States. And here we have some photographs from the 1860s or thereabouts, from the mid-19th century, showing baseball being played in various areas. This here is a team from Brooklyn called the Brooklyn Atlantics. They were one of the early successful baseball clubs, again an amateur club at this point. This is the Princeton College 9, the first baseball team fielded by Princeton College. This is a game of baseball that's taking place out in California, so way out west. You have this collection of people out there on a nice sunny day playing a game of baseball. And this one's actually really interesting. It's from around 1860 or so. It shows a game of baseball being played in a schoolyard. You can see the kids over here, the batter, the pitcher throwing the ball. These are some of the earliest images of baseball that we have being played, both bottoms and right there. There are lots of pictures of baseball clubs like the two on the top. So what we see is that by the 1850s and by 1860s, Baseball has certainly become a national phenomenon. It is a game that is played across the country. Has this varying set of rules, has different aspects of the game, but the idea of somebody throwing a ball at somebody holding a stick and the person with the stick hitting the ball and running around bases does become part of the national consciousness. So much so that by 1860, baseball is often used as a metaphor for politics. We can look at this political cartoon, which is actually one of my favorite political cartoons when I teach American history. I always point this one out. It's called The National Game, 3 outs and 1 run, or Abraham winning the ball. It's a cartoon that depicts the politics of the election of 1860, the presidential election of 1860. In that election, you had 4 men vying for the presidency: John Breckinridge, John Bell, Stephen Douglas, and Abraham Lincoln. Well, as this depicts here, who's the one who scores the run? Abraham Lincoln standing over there with the ball. The other 3, Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas, have all struck out. So you begin to see the blending of the idea of baseball with the idea of American politics, all of that incorporated here in just one political cartoon of itself. So the election of 1860 would prove to be a pivotal election in American history, because when Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency in that year, it sparks a secession crisis. By the end of 1860, the state of South Carolina declares itself separate from the United States. It says it has seceded from the United States, and by February of 1861, 7 other states have joined that secession movement. Ultimately, 11 states would try to leave the United States, but form themselves into what is called the Confederate States of America, and the United States would descend into the Civil War. Now, the period of the Civil War was hugely destructive for the United States itself. A tremendously costly war, our bloodiest war, the bloodiest war in our history. Yet, in terms of baseball, the Civil War was hugely significant, because what occurs during the Civil War is that baseball begins to grow and begins to spread. And it is the Knickerbocker rules of baseball that start to become prominent in the game. Now, what happens during the Civil War that allows baseball to spread? Well, you have a lot of men in uniform, a lot of men at arms, a lot of men involved in the fighting. But as with a lot of military service, you're not always doing stuff. You're not always marching, you're not always fighting, you have a lot of downtime. And what were soldiers doing during that downtime? They start to play baseball. Now, because there were so many men from New York and New Jersey who were in the Army, who were parts of the military units across the United States, they are pushing their version of baseball, those Knickerbocker rules. And soon those Knickerbocker rules start to become the accepted rules of baseball. Massachusetts baseball becomes kind of second class, it gets overwhelmed, and it is the New York game that starts to predominate. And in fact, by the 1860s, New York really becomes the center of baseball in the United States. Now, what we see here on screen are just images of baseball being played during the Civil War. This one is a picture of the game taking place in a prisoner of war camp in Salisbury, North Carolina. Union prisoners playing the game of baseball. This other image here is kind of a more complex image. This is taken in formal lessons in Savannah, Georgia. And what you see is Company H of the 48th New York Regiment here in their formation. It's a formal photograph of this grouping formation. And if you look carefully at the background, what's going on over here? You have a bunch of guys playing baseball in the interior of the floor. You can see the pitcher and the batter, guys on base. So you have another snapshot of an early game of baseball being played here with soldiers at war, occupying the fort deep in the South. So what we see during the Civil War is that baseball begins to spread. And in the immediate aftermath of that conflict, as people from New York and from New Jersey, and the surge of people from New York and New Jersey begin to move out to other parts of the country, they bring the New York rules with them. They bring the Knickerbocker rules and the modern game of baseball essentially with them out to other parts of the country, and baseball begins to grow and baseball begins to flourish. Now, at this point, baseball is still an amateur sport. It is something that is done by amateur clubs playing against other amateur clubs, basically for fun. But it does begin to draw crowds. People want to watch the games. And some enterprising businessmen in places like Brooklyn, New York, decide, you know what, I have this field. Why don't I build a grandstand here? We could play baseball there, and I will charge admission for people to come and watch the baseball game. So you begin to see a business aspect creeping into the game of baseball in the aftermath of the Civil War. And all that leads to is the growth of baseball organizations and eventually the professionalization of baseball itself. Now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, you do begin to see groups coming together to formalize the rules, to protect the rules, to organize competitions against other groups. One of the first national baseball associations, the National Association of Baseball Players, which begins around 1857 and will continue to grow through the Civil War. It goes under business, however, in 1870. Now, this National Association of Baseball Players wasn't an amateur organization. It was those amateur players organizing themselves into an entity to arrange those competitions against other amateur groups. But as we see people starting to make money on baseball, in baseball, landowners setting up those grandstands, setting up baseball fields, money begins to creep into the game and into the players itself. And you begin to see kind of a population shift in baseball, if you will. Early baseball was a domain of the upper middle classes. Who had a leisure time that could go out and pay for the duties of the club and go out and spend time playing. After the Civil War, however, you begin to see, as money becomes available in baseball, you begin to see other members of American society gravitating toward baseball, beginning to play the game. Working class individuals begin to play the game of baseball. Immigrants coming to the United States begin to get involved in the game of baseball. But playing baseball is an expensive enterprise, essentially. So how do you keep these other classes in, those lower classes, the working classes involved in the game? Well, they have to start to make money. You have to start to compensate the players. And when we see that happening, we begin to have the emergence of professionalization in baseball. And that ultimately leads to 1871, the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, essentially a profit-sharing enterprise that is established among the various clubs. If we are going to be playing in this guy's park, and he has grandstands and he's going to sell tickets, that we want a cut of the tickets, and we will distribute that cut of the tickets among the players on the team. So it was a way of profit sharing in many cases between the players and the park runners, the field owners. Eventually, that Association of Professional Baseball Players is superseded by the development of the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. A shift away from the players to club organizations. Essentially, what you start to have are owners assembling clubs, assembling teams, paying some of their star players, having profit gate sharing with the other players, and organizing teams to play against other professional clubs. So you see this growth of professionalization in baseball as players become more dedicated to playing the game for money. In 1801, an American Association of Baseball Clubs is established, which was kind of a challenger to the National League of Professional Baseball. That only lasted about a decade. And disappears around 1891, and the National League becomes the dominant professional baseball league in the United States. That's the National League that we still have today. That becomes the entity of Major League Baseball, professional baseball, that will dominate the game, control the rules, and turn baseball really into an industry, into big business. The National League stands supreme until 1901, when finally somebody assumes the creation of the American League of Professional Baseball Clubs. The American League emerges as kind of a response to the heavy-handedness of the National League. Basically, the National League was a monopoly. The American League springs out to challenge that monopoly, and American League owners begin to establish clubs in cities that don't have clubs. They begin to poach the best players from the National League, offering them more money and better facilities and that sort of thing. And you end up having a really bitter struggle between the National League and the American League. And that is how we define the first couple of years of the 20th century in baseball. This competition between National League and American League. Eventually, the two leagues do come into an association, they do reach partnership, and in 1903, they form themselves into what essentially becomes Major League Baseball, with a National League and an American League that will play against one another for a championship at the end of every season. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So the game grows dramatically in terms of its organization, in terms of its business model, for lack of a better term, from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of that growth, however, a lot of that change is due to significant figures that emerge during this period that will become icons of the game, that will influence the way that the game is played. One of those important figures in baseball in the late 19th century is this man, Albert Goodwill Spaulding, better known as A.G. Spaulding. Spaulding was a well-regarded baseball player, a pitcher who played for numerous teams, including the Boston Red Stockings, who later become the Boston Bee Eaters, who later become the Boston Doves, who later become the Boston Braves. And he was basically one of the more famous players of the age. Now, Spaulding himself, in certain ways, revolutionized the game. He is one of the first important players of baseball to use a fielding glove. Prior to this, gloves weren't used by fielders. So imagine you're the catcher at a baseball game. You have a guy throw the ball at you. You have to catch the ball barehanded. Now, it has to be said that the pitchers in the late 19th century were not throwing 95 mile an hour sliders. Right? They were just tossing the ball at it. It's like playing a game of catch, basically barehanded. It hurts, but it could be done. What's really remarkable, you can find images of this if you look up on Google. If you look at the hands of baseball catchers, baseball players from the late 19th century, they're these massive, like mitt-like things. They're just super callous and, really muscular, oftentimes misshapen because
was the ball casted time and most things.
The ball was a different ball than what we have today. It wasn't as hard, although, again, the details of the formation of the ball are established in the late 19th century. The cork core wound with yarn and then cut with leather. The way it was done was different. The tightness of the winding wasn't as profound as it is now, but the ball was not a soft ball. It was still a relatively hard ball. So catching that barehanded, no thank you. Then it takes, he introduced the use of the baseball glove and popularized the use of the glove in fielding the ball. Now, Kurtz has, like I said, a pretty good career as a pitcher in baseball. He compiles a 252 and 65 record with an ERA of about 2.14. If he were playing in the modern game, he'd be making about $20 million a year. And he hit .313 as a career batting average. Not bad at all. At this time, we didn't really have specialized positions in baseball. Fielders pitched, pitchers and fielded, and we played different positions on the field. So, Spaulding is one of these early icons of baseball because of his diversity, but his more important role, perhaps, not just because of his playing, was because he was an entrepreneur. Now, any of you know the name Spaulding?
Well, equipment.
A lot of equipment. In fact, Spaulding and his brothers, in 1876, while he was still a player, began a sporting goods company. And the Spaulding Company will play a huge role in shaping how baseball looks. Spaulding manufactured gloves, they manufactured uniforms and hats and balls. You will see Spaulding later on in life as a business magnate. Spaulding himself also, even after his playing days, remained involved in the game at a managerial level, at an ownership level, as a president of the National League. So he was a hugely influential figure in the development of baseball, the modernization of baseball, and having people use a fielding glove. Of course, popularizing the glove was also good for business, I suppose, because he was manufacturing gloves, so he could sell the gloves that he popularized. Then again, Spaulding becomes a posing figure in the early history of baseball. Playing in the 1870s, the business from the 1870s to the modern day, the Spaulding Company is still producing medals and balls and all that sort of stuff. So by the 1870s, baseball has started to professionalize. It has started to become a business with paid athletes playing against other paid athletes. And professional baseball in the 1870s was really a growth enterprise. The first professional baseball club in the United States is widely believed to be the Cincinnati Red Stockings that we see over here, established in 1870. By the time we get to the mid-1870s, there are many other baseball teams that have sprung up across the northeastern part of the United States. One of the initial teams in the National League was, in fact, this team here, called the Hartford Dark Blues in Hartford, Connecticut. They only played for a couple of years at Hartford before the team was disbanded and relocated to Providence, Rhode Island. They became the Providence Grays. So even cities like Hartford and Providence, which at that time were fairly substantial cities, had professional baseball teams, at least for a short period of time during this period of growth and expansion of the national game itself. Professional baseball was growing. Yet, that growth came at a cost. Because baseball was so popular a sport, and so popular an entertainment, and it was the game that was an enterprise that relied on what happened in the field, it also lent itself to gambling. Baseball and bettors begin to go together. And what we see are a lot of gamblers making money on the outcomes of baseball games or losing money on the outcome of baseball games. Well, if you are a gambler and you want to make sure that, I'm going to bet on this team and I want to make sure that that team wins, how can you perhaps influence the outcome of the game? You can pay some of the other players to lose. Maybe strike out instead of getting a hit. Maybe let that fly ball fall. And that's what we begin to see by the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. In fact, one of the first great scandals in the history of baseball involved a team in Louisville, Kentucky, the Louisville Grays. In 1876, the Louisville Grays were the best team in baseball, one of the best teams in baseball. They had been winning games all summer long, but then suddenly at the end of the summer going into the fall, they started losing games. And losing games in dramatic and mysterious fashions. So much so that people began to ask questions and investigate what was happening. Well, what happened in those investigations? It was found that 4 members of the team had taken money from gamblers to throw the games, to purposely lose the games. Those 4 men, it was Bill Carver, Bill Craver, Jim Devlin, George Hall, and Al Nichols, were all subsequently banned from professional baseball in 1877. So you have one of these first great gambling scandals in baseball that shakes the game, that leads to people being permanently banned from the game of baseball itself. Now, does that happen later on in the story? Certainly. I probably think of at least 1 or 2 other instances right off the top of your head where gambling led to bans from baseball. Anybody have one? Black Sox, certainly, even more recent though. Pete Rose. Pete Rose, all-time hit leader in Major League Baseball. Banned from baseball because of gambling on baseball. So you have this scandal that emerges in 1876, 1877 with the Louisville Grays. Now, one of the interesting aspects of baseball in the late 19th century was that in many ways it reflected the demographics of the United States. It reflected the population of the United States. Many of the players on these early baseball teams were immigrants from other countries. You had a lot of Irish players, you had a lot of English players in American baseball. You had a lot of native-born Americans playing baseball. But one of the issues that does pop up in this period of baseball history is the issue of race. How does race shape American history in general, and how does it come up in baseball? To this point, most of the amateur clubs that had formed in cities were racially segregated. You had white teams, you had black teams, they would occasionally play against one another in these amateur competitions. But once baseball began to professionalize, you start to see a hardening of those racial lines. It doesn't mean that there weren't African American professional baseball players in the late 19th century. In fact, you have men like Moses Fleetwood Walker, who played a single season with the Toledo Blue Stockings in 1884. He is widely considered the first black professional baseball player in the United States. He and his brother were the only African American men on this Toledo Blue Stockings team. And on the field, they were generally accepted by their teammates and by their competition, though they did face certain resentment from some players. And there were certain teams that refused to play against the Blue Stockings if the two Walker brothers were going to be playing on the field. So you have that issue of race cropping up in baseball in the United States. So Moses Fleetwood Walker does play an entire season, that 1884 season of professional baseball. He is widely considered the first African American professional baseball player. But recent scholarship and recent research has shown that he actually was not the first black man to play in a professional baseball game. That actually occurred about 5 years earlier, when William Edward White, who was a student at Brown University and a member of the Brown University baseball team, seen right here, was called upon by the Providence Grays to play a single game of baseball in June of 1879. What happened on that June day is that the first baseman for the Providence Grays was injured. So he was unable to play, and the Grays needed a first baseman, and they turned to the university team in town, and they took their first baseman, William Edward White. Now, the reason why this story is only recently being told is because White was of mixed heritage. His father was white, his mother was of mixed black and white ancestry, and he himself looked like a white man. He was passing as a white man. His race was unknown when he was chosen to play, when he was picked to play in that baseball game. People thought he was a white man named William Edward White. He was, in fact, the son of a formerly enslaved person. So, he is probably the first African-American man to play in a professional baseball game, but he only played in that one game, on that one day, 1879. He ended up playing 2 years at Brown. He played at Michigan for a few years, then he kind of gave up baseball and ended up disappearing from the record for a short time before, I don't remember where he ends up ultimately. But he is one of these forgotten figures in the early history of baseball. Now, what happened to people like Moses Fleetwood Walker? Why is his baseball career so short? Well, it was because of the animosity he faced from others. Particularly, one baseball superstar at the time, a man named Cap Anson. Anson was perhaps the best known and most popular baseball player in the late 19th century. He was an avowed racist and refused to play against teams that had black players. Because of Anson, because of the resistance that Fleetwood Walker faced, the baseball club owners basically made a silent agreement among themselves not to employ other African American baseball players. That would be the rule in professional baseball until 1947, when Jackie Robinson finally breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball. So it would be nearly 60 years after Moses Fleetwood Walker plays when another African American man plays professional Major League Baseball in the United States. Now, what does that mean? And more broadly, there were black baseball teams across the United States playing in the minor leagues, playing semi-professional, playing against other black baseball teams in the United States. In the 1920s, we have the establishment of what are called the Negro Leagues. Those flourished for about a quarter century until Major League Baseball is later integrated in the middle of the 20th century. So by the time we get to the 1870s and 1880s, baseball has certainly become a national phenomenon. It has become very closely intertwined in American culture. It has become one of the defining aspects of American culture at this time. Everybody knew about baseball. Lots of people played baseball in all different places, whether professionally or at the park on a Sunday or whatever. Baseball had become part of the fabric of American life. And what we see is that by this time period, authors and poets and reporters are writing these romantic things about baseball and how baseball defines the American character. Walt Whitman goes off about baseball a lot. He was a big fan of baseball. Mark Twain was a fan of baseball. In fact, he was a follower of the Hartford Dark Blues. So you have all of these prominent people writing and talking about baseball. And it is during this time period that perhaps the best known and one of the more popular poems about baseball is written. Casey at the Bat, written by Ernest Lear in 1888. Now, how many of you know the story of Casey at the Bat?
Something.
The Mudville Nine, right? It really is one of the great, fun poems written in the United States in the late 19th century. A poem about the hopefulness of baseball, the kind of the oddities of the game, the characters that make up the game, and the hopes of a crowd pinned on one great baseball player. As the poem reminds us at the beginning, the outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The home team was losing and the home crowd was despondent. But suddenly, who comes up to bat with a chance to win the game? Mighty Casey, the baseball hero, rippling with muscles and confidence and arrogance. And ultimately, what happens to Casey? Well, as the end of the poem tells us, oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. It really is kind of a wonderful poem that has been portrayed in cartoons and filmed, illustrations, many, many ways. So a great picture of Casey striking out right there. And so we can see that by this time, baseball is very much the American game. It is identified with many of the characteristics of the United States. It is a game that, though it has kind of pastoral qualities to it, you play out in a big open field, it moves at its own pace, was very much an urban game. It grows in the cities of the United States, the cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Those become the engines that drive the growth of baseball. They become the epicenters of the excitement of the game and the centers of the professional aspects of the game. So by the end of the 19th century, baseball has become that national game, has become that idea of America. And early baseball produced numerous baseball stars and baseball heroes, many of those Caseys at the bat. Here's a list of some of those important players. I mentioned Captain Essence, one of the best baseball players of his day, a racist for his time, as many people were, but certainly one of the important figures of the game. You have the pitcher, Andy Cummings, who only played for about 5 years, but his mark in baseball is significant. He's the man who supposedly developed the curveball. He figured out how to throw a curveball, which of course changed his pitching entirely. You have people like Michael King Kelly, who during his career was known as $10,000 Kelly, because the Boston team paid the Chicago team $10,000 for the services of Kelly. That was an exorbitant amount of money at that time. Charles Oldhouse Radler, who played for numerous teams, who was a pitcher and set a remarkable record during his career. In one season, he had 60 wins as a starting pitcher. Starting pitchers today maybe get 30 starts total. So imagine winning 60 games as a pitcher. That's a record that will probably never be touched. You have Buck Ewing, one of the great baseball players of the day. John McGraw really becomes more famous as a manager in the early 20th century, but also one of the stars of the day. Well, B. Willie Keeler, who gets his nickname because of his short stature, but again was a great hitter and fielder. And some guy named Cy Young, who does something important later on in life. Cy Young, of course, the winningest pitcher in baseball history.
more than 500 wins as a pitcher. Incidentally, Cy Young is also the losingest pitcher in baseball history with more than 200 losses as a starting pitcher. But that tells us that he pitched a lot of games, nearly 800 games in his career. Of course, the Cy Young Award for Outstanding Pitcher is today named after Cy Young, one of these great heroes of the late 19th, early 20th century baseball. Now, by the time we get into the 20th century, baseball does begin to change. One of the big changes that we have the emergence of the American League that's challenging the supremacy of the National League, that is becoming the upstart league, if you will, poaching some of those great players from the National League to play in newly formed teams in many newly established ballparks in different cities across the United States. Also establishing new baseball teams in cities that already had a National League team. So you have some cities that end up with 2, maybe 3 baseball teams at the same time. This is also the beginning of what comes to be called the dead ball era. The dead ball era is a period in baseball where the game relied on trickery and speed and a lot of bunting and singles and aggressive base running. That was how runs were manufactured. That's how the game was played. Things like the home run that we embrace today as an important part of baseball were minimized during the dead ball era. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that the balls themselves were not as lively. If you hit them, they didn't go as far. Another reason was that one ball was used for the entire game. Whereas today in baseball, a new ball is put into play about every 3 or 4 pitches, or if the ball gets dirty, a new ball gets put into play. During the dead ball era, you had one ball at the start of the game, and that ball lasted you throughout the entire game. So imagine that ball being repeatedly hit throughout the course of the game. It's going to get deformed, it's going to get dirty, it's going to get kind of junky, it's going to not fly as far as it would have had it been pristine. The ball itself gets darker and dirtier and muckier as the game goes on. Pitchers at this time were allowed to deface the ball. And the spitball was a common pitch that was used. You apply spit to the ball, it changed the flight of it, you rub it in mud, you kind of rough up the surface, it would change the trajectory of the ball, of the pitched ball. So run scoring became very, very difficult during the dead ball era. Yeah, you did have exciting baseball. You had people like Ty Cobb stealing bases. You had Walter Johnson, who becomes the first pitcher to throw a fastball, or the first pitcher to record a fastball. He threw about 89 miles an hour for his fastball. And you have people like Rabbit Marinville, who's known for his hitting exploits. He played in Boston. So you have this transformation of baseball that takes place during the early 20th century. Here in Boston itself, there was already an established baseball team, the Red Stockings. With the establishment of the American League, however, a new team is established in town. They got to be called the Boston Americans. Here we see that 1901 Boston Americans team. The Boston Americans didn't have their own home field, so they often played at the field of the Red Stockings, their across-town rivals. In 1908, the Americans changed their name to the Red Sox. They were able to change their name to the Red Sox because the other team, the Red Stockings, as I mentioned, had become the Bean Eaters, and they become the Doves, and ultimately they changed their name to the Boston Braves. So the Boston Red Sox begin their history as the Boston Americans. They don't get the name Red Sox until 1908. But what we see in Boston are 2 baseball teams, the Braves and the Red Sox, emerging out of this tumultuous period at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, by 1903, the success of the American League had essentially forced the National League to accept this rival, and it led to a merger of the 2 leagues, to the creation of Major League Baseball. So the American League and the National League become professional baseball in the United States. Now, how do we determine who the champion of professional baseball is? Well, in the old days, it was just the National League was the team that had the most wins. They were the champion of baseball. If there was a tournament, the winner of that tournament was the winner. Now that you have 2 leagues, how are we going to figure it out? Well, let's have a postseason. At the end of the season, the best team from the National League will play the best team from the American League. They will face off against each other, and we will very humbly call this enterprise the World Series. So in 1903, with the merger of the 2 leagues, the first World Series is held. It pitted the new team from Boston, the Boston Americans, versus the old team from Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Pirates. In this 8-game series, the Americans end up victorious. The first World Series was won by the team that later becomes the Boston Red Sox. Here we see that leading team in the series. There is the scene at the Huntington Avenue baseball grounds in Boston. Spectators lining the top of the fence, spectators milling around on the field itself during that first World Series in 1903. Those Huntington Avenue grounds are now part of the property of Northeastern University. So the
And we're
history,
looking at building for 30 years, Catholic Physics Center.
the
Grounds. We have a
ticket booth is still there.
yeah.
That's still.
Sign statue. We have a museum.
Is there a home plate there too?
Yeah.
That is the site of the first World Series. Ultimately, the Boston Americans defeat the Pittsburgh Pirates 5-3 in this series, becoming the first champions of Major League Baseball. So, by the early 20th century, the traditions of the World Series are established in baseball. Incidentally, there is no World Series in 1904. The Red Sox, or the Americans, had the opportunity to defend their World Series title, but the champion of the National League, the New York Giants, refused to play because they felt that their opposition was not worthy of playing, that they were not good enough to face off against the New York Giants. So there is no World Series in 1904, but after that, the game continues apace. Now, 1903 is also an important year in kind of establishing the history of baseball. It's because of an article written by this man, Henry Chadwick. Henry Chadwick was an Englishman, a statistician, and a historian of baseball. He lives in the United States right when the first popular guides to baseball, see a 1874 cover over there. He's called the father of baseball because he is really the first person to begin compiling statistics for baseball games and baseball players. He comes up with the concept of the box score. You know, when you look at the newspaper, you get the box score, what did people hit, and that sort of stuff. He comes up with the concept of keeping score of strikeouts by writing a K in the scoring book. He develops the idea of batting average and the idea of the earned run average as tools for weighing the skill of individual baseball players themselves. So he's doing all this in the late 19th century. By the early 20th century, he has this reputation of the father of baseball. In 1903, however, he writes an article saying that the origins of baseball are actually found in those English games like rounders. He is the one who publicly announces this. Most people kind of assume that there was some correlation. He writes this article saying baseball is based on this English game. Now that upsets a great number of people in the baseball establishment, including people like A.G. Spalding. Spalding wanted to embrace the idea that baseball was an American game, that it was created here on whole cloth, that there was no foreign influence in the formation of baseball. Now, part of the reason for that is because in the early 20th century, an all-star team of American baseball players did a tour around the world, bringing the game to different places around the world, to Latin America, to Europe, Asia. And it was seen as a distinctly American product. When Chadwick says this American product comes from England, a lot of those baseball proponents were offended by that and upset by that. So in response, what we see is that Spalding encouraged the heads, the presidents of the American League and the National League to establish a commission to look into the history of baseball. It comes to be called the Mills Commission, which was formed in 1905. The man at the head of the Mills Commission, Abraham Mills over there, had been the former president of the National League in the 1880s, a well-respected individual. He is basically given the task of figuring out the history of baseball, the origins of baseball. Of course, Spalding and many others want baseball to be an American product. And ultimately, what is the conclusion of the Mills Commission? Well, they say that Civil War general, that guy named Abner Doubleday, created baseball in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York. They create that myth of Doubleday creating baseball. It comes out of this commission. There was really only one piece of evidence that the commission had. It was a letter from some guy in Colorado who said he once had a conversation with Doubleday, and Doubleday had said something about creating baseball. That's the only evidence that the commission relied on. Yet in 1908, they published this report saying baseball was created by Abner Doubleday, and therefore it is an American creation, and rounders and cricket and all those other games had nothing to do with the formation of this American sport. Obviously, that wasn't true, but that was the story that baseball develops at that time. Now, by the time we get to the dead ball era and the increasing professionalization of baseball, the establishment of the American and the National Leagues and the World Series and all that sort of stuff, a new generation of baseball stars are emerging that would shape the game in the early 20th century. One of the most important of those early baseball stars is a guy named Honus Wagner, who played much of his career in Pittsburgh. Wagner was a phenomenal baseball player, one of the greats of his day. He ended his career, a 20-year baseball career, with a .328 batting average, compiling over 3,400 hits, and between 1900 and 1911 was 8 times the National League batting champion, in addition to a World Series victory and MVP awards and that sort of stuff. Phenomenal baseball player. We see Honus Wagner here at that couple of times. One of the interesting things, since we have Honus Wagner at bat, is that the bats that were used during the dead ball era were basically heavy clubs. They were not like the baseball bats today. They were massive pieces of wood that took a tremendous amount of strength to hold. You can kind of see the thickness of the bat there, just the girth of it in that image right there. That also prevented, a lot of offensive output. You weren't going to be hitting a lot of home runs with a tree trunk on your shoulder. It takes a lot of effort to swing it. So Honus Wagner becomes one of these early 20th century baseball superstars. Incidentally, Honus Wagner's baseball card is one of the most valuable baseball cards ever produced because there were only 57 of his baseball cards produced because it was a tobacco company that was producing these cards, and they weren't going to pay him enough for his likeness, so he prevented them from printing anymore. So if you happen to come across a Honus Wagner baseball card, even in bad condition, it'll be worth about $600,000. If it's in mint condition, it could be worth $7, $8, $10 million. So start going through those old scrapbooks and mix and see what you find there. Good retiring money. Another important player of the early 20th century is, of course, Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb was he was known as the Georgia Peach, which is kind of an ironic name because he was from Georgia, but he was certainly no peach. He was a rough and tumble baseball player. There's a lot of rumors about his aggressiveness on the base path. Supposedly he sharpened his spikes, and when he would slide into second base, he'd go with the spikes high to kind of make sure the second baseman knew he was there. One of the best baseball players in history had a 367 career average, and for much of the 20th century was the leader in hits, career hits in baseball, for 4,191 hits, a number that was only surpassed by Pete Rose in the late 1980s. So Ty Cobb was really an icon of baseball. Sees aggressiveness on the base path, sees it in there at bat. Notice there's very little protection there when you're at bat. No helmets, no elbow guards, nothing like that. It was you versus the pitcher with only your bat to protect you. Another important player at this time period is a man who comes to be known as Shoeless Joe Jackson. Now he gets the nickname Shoeless Joe because one day in the minor leagues he was playing the game, but he was wearing new cleats, and those new cleats gave him blisters. So he threw the cleats off and was playing the remainder of the game in his stockings. And one of the spectators said, "Hey, look, he's not wearing shoes," and the nickname Shoeless Joe stuck with it. Shoeless Joe was one of the best hitters of his age. He compiled a .356 batting average. His rookie year in baseball, first season he played a complete year in 1911, he hit .408, which is the record for a rookie in baseball. He finished second in the hitting race that year behind Ty Cobb, who hit .411. So it kind of gives you an idea of the proficiency of the batters at that time. Anyway, Shoeless Joe Jackson is one of these baseball icons of the day. Of course, what happens to Shoeless Joe Jackson? He's eventually banned from baseball. We'll get into why that happened. So here he was, one of those significant figures. It said that Babe Ruth modeled his swing after Shoeless Joe Jackson's swing. That's how good a baseball player he was. Now, here's a man who did not have much of an education, was barely literate, and that gets him into a lot of trouble later on that leads to his expulsion from baseball. So you have these stars, you have these icons that are becoming important figures in the game itself. In 1908, there is a remarkable event that happens. The Chicago Cubs win the World Series. Now, why is that remarkable? It was a winner every year, right? Well, the 1908 win by the Chicago Cubs would be their last until 2016. Chicago went 108 years between World Series victories. Some say that it was because of a curse, the Billy Goat curse, but there was a lot of bad luck that was involved with the Chicago Cubs during that span of more than a century between World Series wins. So this is the 1908 Chicago team. A decade later, another team we're familiar with wins the World Series in 1918. The Red Sox. The Red Sox win the World Series in 1918. Now, they had won several World Series. They won in 1916 and 1915, I believe. So they were one of the dominant teams of that time period, of the early 20th century in baseball. Several World Series wins. Here we see that 1918 Red Sox team. I want to point out this figure over here. Anybody recognize who that was? Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was a phenomenon in baseball. He came into the league as a dominant left-handed pitcher, but he was also one of the greatest hitters of the age. And he's in fact transformed from a pitcher into a hitter. In 1918 or 1919, I can't remember which year, he hit a record 29 home runs, which was remarkable. This was at a time when people hit 5 home runs at most in a year. So here you have Babe Ruth hitting the ball all over the place. It's a phenomenal pitcher, really one of the stars of this 1918 Red Sox team. But what happened to Babe Ruth? At the end of the following season, 1919, he's traded. And he's traded to the team in New York, the New York Yankees. Now, why is Babe Ruth traded? Well, what's the popular story about why Babe Ruth was traded in 1919? Well, the popular story is that the owner of the Red Sox, Mr. Crazy, needed money to fund his girlfriend's play on Broadway. That is a story that's made up after the fact. The real reason why Babe Ruth was traded is because many people in the Boston organization thought that he'd become too big for himself, too big for his britches. He was kind of outshining the rest of his teammates. He was kind of the diva on the team, if you will, and he was demanding more money for his services as a baseball player. So they decided to get rid of him. They shipped him to New York in a transfer, you can see over here, some under $25,000. New York sent $125,000 to Boston, and New York got Babe Ruth. Now, this is an important moment in the history of the Red Sox, because what happens to the Boston Red Sox for the next 80-something years? Frustration and futility in pursuing a World Series victory. In fact, it will not be until 2004 that the Red Sox will once again taste victory in the World Series. So from 1918 to 2004. This period is often referred to as the time of the curse of the Bambino. What happens when you get rid of the greatest baseball player of all time? You ship him to your rival in the American League. So we have that happening. Now, this happens in 1919. Let's keep that in mind, because 1919, 1920 is a pivotal period in the history of baseball. It is also during that 1919 season that another gambling scandal emerges in baseball, surrounding this man, Hal Chase. Hal Chase was a pretty good baseball player, but he had excessively close relationships to people involved in gambling. And there was a lot of suspicion that Chase was purposely throwing games for his gambling buddies, was getting paid to make errors in games that could tip the outcome of those games. In fact, he was a player of ability, but he couldn't latch on to any team. He kept getting cut or traded because people wanted to get away from his extracurricular activities. Ultimately, what happened in 1919, his friendliness with gamblers catches up with him, and he is cut from the New York Giants roster because management and the club owner thinks that Chase has been throwing games, has been accepting bribes from gamblers. Ultimately, what occurs is that in 1920, Chase is blacklisted and banned from baseball because of yet another gambling scandal. So you have that intersection of criminality and the national pastime in the early 20th century that does play an important role in kind of shaping the history of the game. This certainly isn't the only incident we see of that. In fact, in the 1880s, a baseball umpire, whose name is escaping me right at the moment, Jim Higgin, is banned from baseball for life for accepting bribes and throwing games. He's the only umpire to be banned, professional baseball umpire to be banned for life. You had other smaller scale gambling scandals that take place in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. All of that pales, however, in comparison to this other event in 1919, the Black Sox scandal. The Black Sox scandal involved the Chicago White Sox in the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. The White Sox were the prohibitive favorite in that World Series. They were the dominant team in baseball at the time. They were the best team in the country. But the White Sox were owned by a man named Charles Comiskey. And Comiskey was notoriously penny pinching, I guess we could say, to the point where he did not pay his players enough. He paid them barely enough to survive. His players claimed that he was often late on their paychecks, so it was a very difficult situation for the players on the White Sox in 1919. So much so that several members of the team who know some professional gamblers accept money from these professional gamblers to perhaps not try their hardest in the World Series, to throw the World Series in favor of the Cincinnati team. Now, nobody expected the White Sox to lose. They were that dominant a team, that prohibitive a favorite. All of the money in the gambling circles was on the White Sox. So when the Cincinnati Reds win the World Series, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a lot of people losing money and very few people making a lot of money. Many of the members of the White Sox had accepted bribes from the gamblers to, again, not play their best in the World Series and ultimately turn in favor of the opposition. Now, one of the players who was caught up in this scandal is Shoeless Joe Jackson. Jackson would be implicated by other conspirators, by other members of the team who had accepted money as being a part of this conspiracy. For his part, however, Jackson never accepted money, and when he heard about the conspiracy, tried to tell the team owner, but Comiskey kept shutting his door on Jackson, wouldn't listen to him. So Jackson essentially did nothing. Now he does have a 375 batting average during that World Series, made no errors in the field, but ultimately when the investigation takes place into what happened in 1919, when a grand jury investigates the case, Shoeless Joe Jackson is brought up with the other conspirators as part of this plot to throw the World Series. Now the grand jury ends up acquitting everybody. There wasn't enough evidence to convict these men of bribery and of throwing the World Series. But the taint of this on the game of baseball was hugely damaging. People, the general public, began to doubt whether baseball was on the level. There were lots of gambling scandals going on. There was all sorts of questions about the game. So much so that it was hurting the bottom line of the team owners. So the team owners said we have to do something to improve public trust in the game, to prove that the game is on the level. So what do the owners decide to do in 1920? They decide to hire a commissioner of baseball who will oversee the game, who will monitor the game, who will protect the integrity of the game. The man who was hired as the first commissioner of baseball is Kennesaw Landis, a well-respected federal judge, and he had a very stern disposition. You get right there. This image always strikes me as kind of like a preacher hurling thunderbolts down at the congregation. He's very angry looking there. The appointment of Landis was hugely important for baseball because it does begin to restore public trust in the game. You now have kind of this outside entity who is maintaining the rules of the game and defending the game from these outside threats from the gamblers. One of the first things that Landis does when he becomes commissioner, however, is he bans from baseball for life the 8 White Sox players who were accused of accepting bribes. Even though they were found not guilty by the grand jury, they are all banned for life from baseball, including shoeless Joe Jackson. He is banned from professional baseball for life. Now, after 1920, Jackson does continue to play baseball under assumed names in a semi-pro capacity. He kind of barnstorms around the country, not using the name Joe Jackson. People know it's him, but he can never play professional baseball again. In fact, to this day, he is banned from the Baseball Hall of Fame. One of the greatest players of his age, not allowed in the Hall of Fame because of his ban. So Kennesaw Landis was brought in to restore faith in the game in 1920. 1920 also marks the end of the dead ball era. And there is one event in particular that leads to that happening. And that is the death of Roy Chapman. Roy Chapman was a shortstop for the team from Cincinnati. And on August 16th, 1920, the team is playing the New York Yankees. Yankees pitcher Carl Mays throws a pitch that strikes Chapman in the head. He collapses on the baseball field unconscious. He is carried from the field and brought to a hospital where he dies the next day. Chapman is the only player to die from a baseball field-related injury in the long history of the game. Now, his death was certainly preventable. One of the reasons why he dies is because he was leaning far over the plate when the pitch was thrown and he didn't move away from the ball. Now, he might not have been able to see the ball because this was the ball that had been played the entire game. It was scuffed, it was dirty, it was brown. So if he couldn't see the ball, he couldn't move out of the way. Plus, it strikes him in the head, which was unprotected. Despite that, baseball does not mandate batting helmets for baseball players for another 3 decades. It wouldn't be until the 1950s or 1960s that batting helmets become commonplace in Major League Baseball. Chapman's death was hugely significant in the story of the game because after this event, umpires were instructed to change the balls frequently in the game. Whenever a ball became discolored, whenever it got dirty, they had to put a new white ball into play. It also marked the end of the spitball period in baseball. The spitball was banned, and defacing the surface of the ball by pitchers was banned after Chapman's death. So what we see after 1920, the demise of the dead ball era, is a period where baseball is transformed, where hitting starts to become the key to victory, where people like Babe Ruth become the icons that they are because of their ability to hit a ball a long way. Home runs start to become the fashion, and we go from the dead ball era into the live ball era of baseball, and really the emergence of baseball as the modern game that we know today. And that is the first 80 years or so of the history of baseball in the United States. In a nutshell, kind of the highlights and lowlights of the period. Does anybody have any questions? There was
Actually, just
Sure.
back to, we had in the cabinet building, we had a couple of trophy cabinets, and they had memorabilia of the, first World Series. One of them was a baseball uniform, and it was like wool.
Yes, they wore wool.
Yeah, it was so
Well,
heavy.
most of the teams wore wool. Some of the teams, one of the early Washington teams wore silk, because I think their owner was a silk merchant, so they had silk uniforms, which must have been nice and cool in a summer day. But yeah, a lot of the early teams wore heavy wool uniforms year-round because wool was pretty durable. Cotton doesn't start coming into play until the 20th century as one of the main materials for uniforms. Now I think they're made up like from the 1970s, everything was polyester. If you look at the Cleveland Indians uniforms from like 1977, they were all like bright red, really awful. But you know, then you have the blended materials and more athletic type materials today. So, yeah, wool was the material for a long time.
Summer school.
Yeah.